Hello, hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Caitlin Sachs, a senior producer for Nova, and today we are in for a big treat, a live conversation with one of the experts we featured in a recent film, Secrets in Your Data, so that you, our audience, can delve further into the content and even ask your own questions of Dr. Rumman Chowdhury, who we have here today with us. Welcome, Dr. Chowdhury. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming. So, we are going to dive deep on AI, and specifically, we want to talk about what you think a positive future with AI could look like and how we will get there. So, a little bit of background: Dr. Chowdhury is the CEO and co-founder of Humane Intelligence, a nonprofit which works to inform the way AI models are built through algorithmic auditing and evaluation. Now, if that sounds confusing, we'll get to what that means. Her work revolves around researching how AI can be used responsibly, and she was also featured in Nova's "Secrets in Your Data," where she gave insight into the seemingly innocent ways internet users can get roped into giving away their data online through cookies, social media, and of course, AI is a whole new layer on top of that. So before we get started, I have enough questions here, probably to go for hours with Dr. Chowdhury. We only have about 40 minutes, but I do hope to get to some of your questions. So if you have questions, put them in the chat, and we will try to get to them. So, Dr. Chowdhury, let's start kind of with the basics. It feels like something has happened in the last few years with AI. It was kind of being developed for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden, a couple years ago, it just sort of started to feel like it is among us now. It's here. What changed? What has happened?
Oh, it's great that you put it that way because this technology actually has been around for quite some time. And actually, to be frank, it has actually been used on people for a very long time. We just didn't have direct access to it. So, what happened in November of 2022 was when ChatGPT launched, it was not just a revolution in the technology. Actually, the big revolution was on the accessibility of the technology. So, before then, for people like myself who'd been working in the field of AI, explaining to regular people how AI is used in their lives seemed very abstract. I could say something about recommendation systems or hiring algorithms, but it didn't really hold water. It didn't mean anything. Now, with ChatGPT or with any of the large language models, you interact with an AI model like you're texting your friend. And it's a few things. One, it's the very text-like design, which is something that most people are very familiar with. And second is the real-time interactivity with what everybody knows is an algorithm. So the big revolution in fall of 2022 was the accessibility and the direct access to the technology.
And it feels like since then, uh, there's kind of two camps that people are generally following in. One is this is really exciting, this is cool. AI is going to help us in so many ways. And then the other extreme of that is it's dangerous. It could destroy humanity. It's going to, make climate change worse versus going to make climate change better. And so it feels like a little bit of polarization there. Where on that spectrum, and I assume it's actually a spectrum between wearing rose-tinted glasses versus dripping crimson blood, where do you sit there? What's your perspective on what AI is going to mean for humanity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not wearing rose-tinted glasses or dripping crimson blood. I would probably be somewhere right in the middle. And so, by background, I'm a social scientist, and I think of all of these things as tools that are wielded by people. So, fundamentally, the language of AI is very interesting to me because it's quite unique. We talk about this technology as if it is making its own unique decisions, when actually it's not true. Human beings design the technology to go do things, right? So where I sit with this is really it's a function of our ability to get ourselves in order, our ability to ensure that the technology is built the right way. So, it's up to us to make the right decisions.
Um, so let's take it away from the extremes then. What what are the most positive ways, realistic positive ways you foresee AI impacting some society? What are some of the good things that you think we might actually this technology might allow us to realize?
Yeah, so I love that question because I think as we think through, as I said earlier, it's up to us to decide where it goes. So what we have to have is an affirmative vision. We have to have an idea of where we want to go with the technology. And there's a few things that we are seeing really positive and helpful advances. The first and probably the most obvious to most people is how medicine and medical research is being improved. So we have AI models that can, help geneticists, a lot of whom are actually data scientists, create very specific approaches to addressing diseases that we've not been able to crack, like ALS or cancer. In fact, there's conversations about, we may be able to have vaccines and, cure certain cancers within our lifetimes. This is amazing because, frankly, a lot of these questions about medical research are good questions that AI can help answer. It's not this magical technology. It's technology that's able to crunch a lot of data without getting tired, right? Do it incredibly mathematically and agnostically. And that's actually the help that geneticists needed in order to do what they do really well. So I think we're going to see, for example, CRISPR technology. So medicine is one. The second I actually like to think about, interestingly, which is one thing people don't think about, is weather prediction. And this sort of relates to climate change. So we're all now experiencing the weather being more extreme. So I live part-time in Houston, Texas. What used to be called 100-year floods and 100-year hurricanes now happen every 5 to 10 years. And the ability to predict well in advance when a dangerous weather situation is going to happen is quite valuable for saving human lives. So now we can know weeks in advance that there's some sort of adverse weather condition forming and that this is the general path it might go in, so you can be prepared. That's incredibly powerful. And actually, it's already saving human lives today. So those are the two examples I like to point to as to how AI is being used really positively and very helpfully.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, I mean, a lot of people go to the Terminator scenario. Is that what is keeping you up at night, or are there other dangers that are more concerning, more realistic ones that are more concerning to you?
Yeah, so I think we are quite some time away from AI making decisions. I know a lot of these fears are sort of shaped by movies, and it's interesting that a lot of these like scenarios people talk to are literally plots of movies. But the things I'm more worried about are the harms we're actually already seeing manifest today. So one is, the centralization of power and wealth into the hands of very, very few people who now have influence that's greater than any given government. That is something to be concerned about. That's something we should always be concerned about. It's not something unique to artificial intelligence. I think the other thing is how these AI tools are being used in a way that is directly impactful on our lives. And we don't have the ability to decide whether or not this tool is used on us, how it is used on us, and also our ability to even give feedback on whether or not it's performing accurately or correctly. So that's a lot of the work that I'm passionate about is how can we get regular people's perspectives in how the data is collected, how these AI models are used. And these are not new narratives. Like the narratives we've had about Silicon Valley for years is that it's sort of this very small group of people who are making these decisions that have very massive impact. And the average person, no matter where you are in the world, in the United States, in Senegal, in the UK, in France, you don't have a say in how these models are being used. And finally, it's that these models are often being used to make major decisions in a way that you will never see. So algorithms being used to determine your riskiness for being given a loan or whether or not you'd be a good fit for a job. There are also ways in which we already know that many algorithms and AI models, can radicalize individuals. I think the new face of generative AI is supercharging bad actors that are out there. So I've done some research on generative AI and gender-based violence online, demonstrating how easy it is to create an automated hate campaign with very minimal ability to code. So I think there are some very serious concerns, but you'll probably see the common thread in this is how people are going to use the technology in malicious ways rather than how the technology will somehow do malicious things magically.
Mm. So you just said that basically we're already starting to see some of the harms that it can do. Um, to a certain extent, it kind of feels a bit like the cat is out of the bag. It's not just OpenAI now with
Mhm.
ChatGPT. There's a whole bunch of companies, a whole bunch of models. how do you go about even starting to try um, to rein in what AI and to prevent against those harms?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I'm very heartened by is that we've seen a massive global regulatory response. So I wrote an op-ed for Wired in April of 2023 about how AI needs global oversight. And the reason I think about it is actually it's the negative externalities of this technology is borderless. So somebody can be subject to a radicalization campaign from somebody sitting in a totally different country. So passing laws in, let's say, the United States about not
Mm.
having hate speech or whatever does not mean anything if the person or the entity creating the hate speech sits in Canada or wherever, right? So like I wrote this article. When I wrote that article a little over a year ago, we had no global entities really working on it. Now we have many. We have UN, we have the OECD, we have different global safety institutes. We have a lot of existing bodies and new bodies forming to think through these problems globally. So I think that's one is, we're thinking through what a regulatory response looks like. I think the second is, part of it is just going to actually be education. Like regular people need to get smart about how AI works, what manipulation looks like. And we've sort of been through this before, right? We've been through this, interestingly, with radio and broadcast television, right? Where people got smart at discerning good and bad information. I think the interesting thing about generative AI is that it's able to create fake media in ways that we are not familiar with. So most people prior to, let's say, 2022 would consider a photo, and we're all familiar with Photoshop, but we would generally consider a video or a photo to be factual. Well, now we're going to have to negotiate what it means to watch a video and think, oh, that might not be real, which is very new to us. So we're making sort of these new connections. So I think there's responsibilities for everybody here. We have governments, we have companies, there's also civil society organizations, which, can and are, doing a lot of things to help. And then there's sort of the regular person who needs to be smarter about the new generative AI world that we're living in.
So you are a responsible AI fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Tell me about what responsible AI means to you. I'm guessing it's a bit more than like just not using it to cheat on your homework or something like that.
I also have some thoughts on that as well. I don't know if it's cheating and maybe more of a re-examination of education that needs to happen, but we can put a pin in that one. So responsible AI is, to me, it's actually quite a simple definition. We're building artificial intelligence that helps everybody, not just a few people, not just people with very specific problems. If truly this technology is supposed to be world changing, which is just a direct quote from all these companies say, well, then it needs to serve everybody in the world. And responsible AI examines all the ways in which this technology can do that. First by asking, is this necessary? Is this useful? Is this helpful? Where are the gaps and how do we fill those gaps?
Um, let's take a pin out of the education thing because I think that's something that's on a lot of folks' minds.
It
I have a young
is.
child. I don't know if you have children, but one thing I think a lot about is, oh my gosh, that fourth grade essay is going to be really easy to write. Um, what are your thoughts on how this is going to change not just education, but how humans think?
I really love your question. So there's sort of two parts to it, and these are really commonly asked. I do a lot of talks at universities, actually all over the world, and I talk to educators, I talk to students, and interestingly, it's the same common fear. So it's not that students are like super enthusiastic, like, yeah, I never have to write an essay again. A lot of college students are really worried about what they should major in, what their life path should be, and they're very concerned about what an AI workforce is going to look like, given that we don't know. So first is when you think through educational systems, right? Like we actually have to think through what is the purpose of education, right? The purpose of education is not just to like make kids suffer through, reading Shakespeare and then write a thing about it, but actually it's to teach them how to gather and synthesize information to create new and interesting thoughts, right? To the extent that like, an eighth grader can do something like that, right? And it's interesting because it's teaching them how to think, right? I taught, I was in grad school. I taught students for quite some time at a college level. I think the most important thing you learn in college is how to think, not what to think. And I think some of these concerns are sort of built around well, how then are we going to teach people what to think if the AI is going to just tell them what the answer is? Well, then that's the wrong approach to what education's for. So now we live in a world in which we have this very sophisticated tool, which, by the way, is not the first time we've been here. The internet, too, is a very sophisticated tool that enables people to do really advanced research and learn things they couldn't learn before. Well, we've navigated this. So the way I like to think of how AI, first of all, like I would not suggest any educator ban AI in the classroom because it's just not setting your students up for success. They will enter a world in which generative AI is going to be used in the workforce. It's going to be used in various situations. They need to create students who are able to have good discernment and critical thinking. They need to learn how to use these tools to make their natural abilities better. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's literally nothing wrong with using this technology wisely. So the job of an educator is to teach these students how to use it wisely. So this might mean, reforming your standard curriculum. And just as an example of some forward-thinking professor friends of mine who have already incorporated ChatGPT, they'll create assignments like, use Chat GPT or whatever, use a large language model to help you create 10 different hypotheses for this paper. You then have to sort of figure out what works and what doesn't and give 3 arguments as to why this is good and bad and then select one. The second one could be using generative AI, write a general outline, including sources for your paper, and again, like you have to tweak it, right? And the final thing would be write your own paper. But you'll notice how, like, every step of the way, you're teaching people how to use this tool in a way that's leveraging their own skills and abilities versus treating it like an adversarial, like an enemy. And again, like, I think it's really important because they will be entering a workforce where they need to critically analyze. So the thing that I think a lot about as it relates to just society and general AI is critical thinking, right? So how do you, and this sort of relates to anything, right? How does a student know if the output of an AI model is good or bad? How are you going to know if this robocall is real or fake? How will you know if that's an email from actually your banker or an email that's a phishing scam? It's all actually the same thing. People we're all on this journey to get better at discerning good and bad.
So you make a really great point that how we educate kind of is a direct line to what the workforce of the future we are educating for is.
Hmm.
It seems like we're in a bit of a challenging moment because we're still figuring that out. What does that workforce of the future look like? And I think one of the biggest anxieties about AI is that it will start taking our jobs. So, so what are your thoughts on that? Will Nova be produced by AI in 10 years, or
Uh,
and if so, then what will I do?
I
Or
should hope that Nova is not produced by AI in 10 years because it would not be anywhere near as creative or interesting or as thoughtful, right? Because the one thing AI cannot do is come up with own unique and original and interesting ideas, and particularly ideas that understand the human condition. Like AI is just not capable of doing that. So while you could probably generate or use AI to create more Nova-like things, will it be as educational and interesting and inspiring? No, it won't be. I think that's really the thing we have to think of. So now we are in a world in which generating content is extremely cheap and easy. So we're going to unfortunately go through this painful period, and we're already talking about it, right? They call it AI slop, where there is just a ton of just garbage out there and we're wading through this slop. And no matter what social media platform you're on, some are worse, some are better, but the AI slop is everywhere. So now we're gonna get past this initial excitement of, ooh, anybody can make a video about anything. Everyone should be an influencer. Everyone should have videos made by AI. And we're gonna, hopefully, and my hope and my faith in humanity is that we will start asking ourselves why. And we will start to go for quality rather than quantity. When I say quality, I mean quality of the idea, quality of the perspective, right? And we're already seeing this on some social media platforms like TikTok, where, being genuine and authentic is more important than being very polished. I find that very fascinating. If you look at the evolution of social media, you had Instagram, and we have terms like Instagram face, right? Where everything had to be perfect. Well, now we can use AI to create that perfect image. So now what we value are human flaws. I find that beautiful. I find that really beautiful that we just look, no matter what happens, we look for
Mm,
authentic connection. So I don't think that's
mm,
happening. And especially to answer your question about future of work, there have been two papers I think are quite meaningful because they basically both come to the conclusion that we're not going to have mass joblessness. So the two things are, one is there's this paper that came out when GPT-4 came out in April, I want to say, of 2023. And it's called GPTs or GPTs. And it was OpenAI researchers working with economists to see how large language models would impact different sectors. What they estimated was that 80% of jobs would have about 10% automated away. So you could see it as the impact of like email, right? It made communication faster and easier. Now it's going to make ideation faster and easier. That's pretty much for 80% of jobs. And I think they said about 19% of jobs would have about 80% automated away. And those are industries that really need to sort of think about what they're working on. Journalism was one of them. But again, my faith is that like we're already seeing, creative fields. So I think they had, if I'm remembering correctly, like paralegal, journalism, photography, a lot of the creative fields. But again, this is assuming that this is just based on content production, not necessarily people's tastes and discernment of what content they're looking for. The second paper that's very fascinating is by this very well-respected economist, Darren Acemoglu. It was a paper published in NBER, which is a very respected economics journal, and it later was the basis of some work that came out of Goldman Sachs. And he was estimating the total factor of productivity. So what is the macroeconomic impact of AI models, and he found it to be sub 1% over the next 10 years. So, but what will be interesting, and his paper is certainly worth a deep dive. It is dry, it's an economist paper. The Goldman Sachs report is interesting because it's more of like interview based, maybe for the average person who doesn't want to read a dry econ journal paper. A little bit more like direct and compelling, but basically saying that there will be some impact on the market. Does it mean we have to all explore universal basic income? Does it mean we're going to have a 2 hour workday or whatever, and AI is going to do the rest? Probably not.
mm. And it sounds like, forgive me if I'm distilling not quite right, but it sounds like what you're saying is essentially one of the ways that individuals can start thinking of making themselves irreplaceable by AI is leaning into more about what makes them human. Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely. That
which
is literally the answer.
it sounds obvious when you say it, but there's something kind of liberating about that. That we've spent so much of the history of humanity in our heads, and there are other aspects. Some of it's still in our heads, creativity, but there are other aspects that we can might be freed up to lean into.
I hope so. It's interesting because these same conversations happened with the first industrial revolution. There were so many conversations about, people will only have to work 4 hours a week and the rest of the time could be spent towards leisure, etc. And frankly, what we have found with every technological advancement is actually we don't work less, we work more. So I think the bigger question to ask ourselves is when is enough enough? When is enough productivity enough? Like, so great, now I can work faster. Does that mean I need to continue to produce more and more and more? Or, can we draw boundaries for ourselves and say this is actually a sufficient amount of production, right? That this is enough. Like I've contributed, I don't need to contribute at my maximum breaking point. And it's interesting because we are seeing some of these conversations happening today, especially around Gen Z and how Gen Z acts differently in the workplace from millennials and previous generations. So, like, again, as a social scientist, I always see these things as socio-technical, right? These are technological things that exist in the world. And what matters is this interplay between people and AI, and not just the AI in a bubble or people in a bubble.
So I want to step back a second and talk a little bit more about your work specifically. So you're also the founder of Parity Consulting, which provides
Mhm.
short-term expert-led responsible AI consulting and auditing. What does that mean? How do you evaluate AI for harmful behaviors?
In short, it can be a lot of math, and it's like a
Mhm.
lot of math plus a lot of understanding how people work. So I'm a quantitative social scientist. My interest is understanding patterns of human behavior using data. That's what I've basically always done. Even though I came into Silicon Valley after working in other fields, but that has always been what has been really compelling and interesting to me. So what's fascinating about some laws that have passed, for example, the Digital Services Act in the UK. So the Digital Services Act basically says that companies that fall under its purview, which are sort of the biggest companies in the world, so it's all the companies that directly impact consumers, so most social media companies, et cetera, need to demonstrate that their algorithms are not harmful under certain conditions. So, for example, it's not adversely impacting the course of democracy. It's not adversely, influencing children and young people. It's not violating fundamental human rights. Now, that is super interesting to me because that's really hard to do. Like, I worked at Twitter. I led the algorithmic ethics team at Twitter. That is really hard, and it's hard because what is it? It's not hard because it's mathematically hard. It's hard because it's conceptually hard to say, well, what does it mean to have impacted the course of democracy? Like, of course, people are on social media conversing about Democrat, like right now, there's elections happening all over the world. Of course, we're on social media talking about it. So, how do we discern how much social media is impacting it and whether or not it is an adverse impact or negative impact? These are actually more like almost philosophical questions, but the job of someone like myself, an algorithmic auditor or assessor, is to take that out of philosophy and make it something measurable and grounded. So this could mean understanding like who is impacted by the algorithms, collecting data about people's behaviors and how they've changed over time, maybe even thinking of ways in which people who are not engaged online are different from people who are engaged online. There are a lot of really clever and creative ways that you can do this work, but it actually remains, um, not a very well-defined field. We don't have standards and best practices for algorithmic auditing. One of my concerns and one of the reasons for my nonprofit is that we're writing more and more laws like the Digital Services Act, but we don't have the workforce that understands how to do this labor.
Mm. So, are there any sort of examples to sort of make it a little bit more concrete, like how you might test a specific algorithm, like what the test is, how that works, what sort of work goes into it?
Yeah, so during my time at Twitter, one of the papers that my team published that actually made quite a bit of a splash was looking at algorithmic amplification of political content on our algorithmic feed versus reverse chronological. So for folks who are unfamiliar with Twitter, we had two different feeds. One is curated by an algorithm, so that's whatever homegrown AI models that we had made. Another one is reverse chronological, meaning that you saw things in the reverse timeline order of when people posted it. So what's interesting is that creates a nice experiment. So we can look at the kinds of political content that are pulled up by our algorithm versus what people would naturally see without that algorithm. So in the test, we found actually that in 7 out of 8 countries, there was a center right lean or amplification by the algorithm. So that's really interesting, right? It's a very interesting finding. But here's where it gets
And
hard
to be clear,
because as
this was Twitter circa around what year? What
this
year
was
of Twitter?
Twitter 2020 actually. It was a great question
Okay.
because it sort of feeds into the second half of how to think through this problem. So this was I think our data was from April to August of 2020. So during that time, there were many elections, including in the US, right? So it's a very fascinating time period to look at because when we're talking about amplification of political content, it's influencing people's perspectives as they're about to go vote, right? So it's really interesting. So we find that in 7 out of 8 countries, there's a center right leaning. Now, the question that we don't know the answer to, we know the phenomenon that's happening. We actually don't know why. We don't know why it's happening because, as I mentioned, all these things are socio-technical, right? These algorithms are built. The purpose of the algorithm is to amplify content that people are engaging with. So it could be that between April to August of 2020, most people in the world are engaging with center-right content. In which case, what is the answer? What is fair? What is correct? And what is appropriate? Do we then say, oh, well, you're only allowed to see this much content, doesn't matter what everybody else is talking about? Or do we show people what they want to see? So, or is the problem that the algorithm is biased? So one phrase people are increasingly aware of is algorithmic bias. But algorithmic bias means a very specific things. It means that although we have not coded something into the algorithm, it is figuring that thing out and it is artificially amplifying it even though it's out of scope. So I'll give you a really good example of how that happens in the real world. in the United States, people's zip code and race are highly correlated with each other because we just live in a segregated country. As a result, if somebody, let's say, creates an algorithm where they're using zip code and geography for whatever reason, it is inadvertently picking up race. So the output of the model may end up being biased based on race, and the bias is
Mm.
not because they put the variable in, but because these two variables are really correlated with each other, right? So when I think about social media algorithms in the situation we had, well, if it were to be algorithmic bias, then the answer is specifically that even though there was no variable in our Twitter algorithms that said, what is the political leaning of this post, somehow it was artificially picking it up. To figure that out, my team would actually have to deep dive and do quite a bit of work. Or the hypothesis could be that the algorithm is working just fine. The issue is that it's amplifying what people are talking about. And if that is the issue, that was my hypothesis. Unfortunately, we did not get to test that before our team got fired,
Mm.
when Elon Musk took over. Um, if that is the case, then that's like um, it's a deeper question about power and authority, right? Who gets to decide what isn't correct for an algorithm's performance? Who gets to decide what
Mm.
isn't fair? Who gets to decide what is the correct amount of information someone should be seeing? So all of these questions, and all this actually exists in generative AI as well. These are all questions of content moderation. And companies and the CEOs who run these companies, they get to decide. They get to decide who gets to see what, when, and how. And it's really obvious to us on social media because, people will get deplatformed, someone will get banned, they'll get removed,
Mm.
they'll talk about shadow banning. But by the way, the same thing happens with generative AI models. These models are taking data and they're synthesizing it for you, and they're telling you what to think. So now it's another layer between you and a search engine, whereas in a search engine, it's curating sources. Generative AI is another layer saying, you know what, you don't have to read the sources. I'm going to digest it for you and I'm going to tell you what to think. So I just want people to understand that the questions that we have asked of social media companies are actually the same questions we should be asking of generative AI companies.
Mm. And so I hear you that you feel that it is really the companies or whoever holds the power that is sort of responsible in a lot of ways for these algorithms. One of
Mm-hmm.
the big, and I have to ask because it's the stuff of science fiction. One of the big concerns with AI is that as it becomes smarter and smarter, it could reach something that is similar to sentience. And I'm curious for your thoughts on that. If it thinks like a human, then at what point does it become, what is sentience? At what point might it become that, or could it never become that?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally the structure of these models is that it doesn't think like a human. So AI is the simplest way I explain artificial intelligence is it uses data to make a prediction. And it can make a very sophisticated prediction. But actually, when you interact with let's say, a language model, it is making a prediction. It is making a prediction of the bag of words. Literally, it's like a group of words that best fits together that will give the response that is what you are looking for. So it's actually a predictive model in that sense, which is why when we talk about how AI hallucinates, how it makes up things that are wrong, that's not a bug, it's a feature. It is part of, because it does not understand context. It doesn't understand why you're asking, it doesn't understand your intent. It just sees this laundry list of words, and it calculates the probability that other words will fit in to give you the response you're looking for. So that's not how the human brain works. And I'll also add that even if we think about at what level of sophistication today's AI models are and how much data and input they need to get there, the average child requires significantly less data to have a higher level of cognition than today's very rudimentary AI models. And there's already
Mm.
conversations of we have, sort of reached the max of, the data that exists in the world. So I think there's a couple of things. One is that we are hitting very real ceilings in the capabilities of the AI models that are built because they are very inefficient on how they use data, right? So
Mm.
the models that we have today, which aren't particularly good, they're okay, and they're nowhere near human cognition levels, right? Have already nearly exhausted all of the data that exists in the world. Isn't that crazy? Whereas the average child can do so much more with so much less. So like the basic structure, the architecture is off. And second is I think
Mm.
even just, and again, everything for me starts to become a not a philosophical question, but like a thinking question. What do we mean by sentience, right? So it's very interesting to look at how the companies are defining it. So OpenAI defines artificial general intelligence as the automation of all tasks of economic value, which is very fascinating. Isn't that really interesting? So
Hmm.
is that
Hmm.
what the human, right? Is that what the human experience is? Is the human experience being an economically productive unit? And when we are not economically productive, when you are a baby or when you're ill or when you're pregnant and not working or when you're elderly, are you not a human anymore? Are you not worthy of existing? Because by that definition, you are no longer intelligent because you are not economically productive. When the first, like, I have chills every time I say that because the first time someone
Hmm.
told me this is Dr. Shannon Bowler who told me that she just published this amazing new book called The AI Mirror. I had to sit with that for like 10 minutes because what a reductive way of thinking about what intelligence is. Like it makes me sad if we are going to correlate human sentience and our purpose of being, our consciousness, with only economic productivity, literature out the door, music out the door, unless you're making billions of dollars like Taylor Swift, right? You can't do
Hmm.
anything for yourself. You can't do anything out of love. You can't just write a poem or bake a bad cake.
Hmm.
None of those are economically productive, therefore they have no value.
Hmm. Interesting. We don't have too much time left. We're going to take one question from our YouTube chat, and then I have one final question for you. So, a someone in chat asks, how do we filter personal bias that developers may add to AI systems to avoid creating a bias system?
That's a great question. I think the answer to that, interestingly, is that there's two parts to the question, to the answer. One is to frankly have more diverse teams. The way you filter personal bias is to not have everybody on the team coming from the same background, whether it is economic, linguistic, geographic, gender, race, you name it, right? So we just need more diverse teams and broader perspectives. The second is some of the work that I work on which is giving more people access to evaluate AI models. So what I work on with human intelligence is red teaming. So as I mentioned in the very beginning, the big revolution was in accessibility. So anybody was able to interact with an AI model. What I've done is create ways for everyday people to evaluate AI models using that same functionality. So we have done these exercises with architects, with scientists, we're doing them with students, et cetera, like a wide range of people in order to get feedback to help improve how AI models are built.
Great. So, final question. This is a little bit of a fun one. A number of you in the YouTube chat will know that Nova has been designing an escape room, Nova's first escape room we've ever designed, and it has an AI theme. So, if you're in the chat, we have another live stream coming up at 1 where we're going to be doing the final design session on that. But I want to run the scenario past you, Dr. Chowdhury, to get your take on our scenario. Let us know how well we're doing. So it's the year 3000. It's a few days before New Year's Day in the year 3000. The world is run by a benevolent AI that takes care of everything. There's no more disease. Humans spend their time making music and playing games, watching science documentaries, doing yoga, stuff like that. But a few days before Y3K, there starts to be things start to go wrong. There seems to be a bug and things are falling apart. And so we have a group of engineers that need to come back in and retrain the AI, reclaim all the lost knowledge, and retrain the AI to save the world. What do you think? What will year 3000 really look like with AI?
That would make a great movie. Um, I think that's an amazing scenario. What I would love if the answer is if we're going to retrain an AI, we're actually going to make sure we have diverse perspectives and a wide range of people who think about very, very different things. So you need like a botanist and a, author and a musician and like all these kinds of people in the room to make sure that you're actually making a benevolent AI. And what an interesting concept, right? This idea of a benevolent AI, like benevolent in what aspect, right? To ensure that we are everything that's like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing. Like, what does benevolent even mean? Making sure we are all fed and clothed, because that's like the bottom tier. Are we intellectually engaged? Because that's actually the tier we want to be at. So what a fascinating scenario. I love it.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time. How can folks keep up with your work going forward? Where can they find you?
Yeah, so our website is humane-intelligence.org, and I'm also on LinkedIn. You can just find me by my name.
All right, great. And you can also stream Secrets in Your Data, which Dr. Chowdhury is featured in on the PBS app and website. If you're interested in figuring out what that whole escape room thing is about, stay tuned for another live stream from Nova at 1 p.m., where you can help us finish designing the escape room, and we'll show you some designs. So more info there. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Chowdhury.
Thank you for the insightful conversation.
Have a good one.